But it is very evident that in the metaphysical distinction between action and passion, though long since become common and the general vogue, due care has not been taken to conform language to the nature of things, or to any distinct, clear ideas, as it is in innumerable other philosophical metaphysical terms used in these disputes, which has occasioned inexpressible difficulty, contention, error, and confusion. And thus probably it came to be thought that necessity was inconsistent with action, as these terms are applied to volition. First, these terms, action and necessity, are changed from their original meaning, as signifying external voluntary action and constraint, in which meaning they are evidently inconsistent, to signify quite other things, vis-a-vis volition itself and certainty of existence. And when the change of signification is made, care is not taken to make proper allowances and abatements for the difference of sense, but still the same things are unwarily attributed to action and necessity in the new meaning of the words, which plainly belong to them in their first sense, and on this ground maxims are established without any real foundation, as though they were the most certain truths and the most evident dictates of reason. But however strenuously it is maintained that what is necessary cannot be properly called action, and that a necessary action is a contradiction, yet it is probable there are few Arminian divines who, if thoroughly tried, would stand to these principles. They will allow that God is, in the highest sense, an active being, and the highest fountain of life and action, and they would probably not deny that those that are called God's acts of righteousness, holiness, and faithfulness are truly and properly God's acts, and God is really a holy agent in them. And yet I trust they will not deny that God necessarily acts justly and faithfully, and that it is impossible for him to act unrighteously and unholy. The reasons why some think it contrary to common sense to suppose those things which are necessary to be worthy of either praise or blame. It is abundantly affirmed and urged by Arminian writers that it is contrary to common sense and the natural notions and apprehensions of mankind to suppose otherwise than that necessity, making no distinction between natural and moral necessity, is inconsistent with virtue and vice, praise and blame, reward and punishment. And their arguments from hence have been greatly triumphed in, and have been not a little perplexing to many who have been friendly to the truth as clearly revealed in the Holy Scriptures. It has seemed to them indeed difficult to reconcile Calvinistic doctrines with the notions men commonly have of justice and equity, and the true reasons of it seem to be these that follow. 1. It is indeed a very plain dictate of common sense that natural necessity is wholly inconsistent with just praise or blame. If men do things which in themselves are very good, fit to be brought to pass, and very happy effects, properly against their wills, and cannot help it, or do them from a necessity that is without their wills, or with which their wills have no concern or connection, then it is a plain dictate of common sense that it is none of their virtue, nor any moral good in them, and that they are not worthy to be rewarded or praised, or at all esteemed, honored, or loved on that account. And on the other hand, that if, from like necessity, they do those things which in themselves are very unhappy and pernicious, and do them because they cannot help it, the necessity is such that it is all one whether they will them or no, and the reason why they are done is from necessity only and not from their wills. It is a very plain dictate of common sense that they are not at all to blame. There is no vice, fault, or moral evil at all in the effect done, nor are they who are thus necessitated in any wise worthy to be punished, hated, or in the least disrespected on that account. In like manner, if things in themselves good and desirable are absolutely impossible with a natural impossibility, the universal reason of mankind teaches that this wholly and perfectly excuses persons in their not doing them. And it is also a plain dictate of common sense that if the doing things in themselves good or avoiding things in themselves evil is not absolutely impossible with such a natural impossibility, but very difficult with a natural difficulty, that is, a difficulty prior to and not at all consisting in will and inclination itself, and which would remain the same, let the inclination be what it will, then a person's neglect or omission is excused in some measure, though not wholly. His sin is less aggravated than if the thing to be done were easy, And if instead of difficulty and hindrance there be a contrary natural propensity in the state of things to the thing to be done, or the effect to be brought to pass, abstracted from any consideration of the inclination of the heart, though the propensity be not so great as to amount to a natural necessity, yet being some approach to it, so that the doing the good thing be very much from this natural tendency in the state of things, and but little from a good inclination, then it is a dictate of common sense that there is so much the less virtue in what is done, and so it is less praiseworthy and rewardable. The reason is easy, vis-a-vis, because such a natural propensity or tendency is an approach to natural necessity, and the greater the propensity, still so much the nearer is the approach to necessity, and therefore as natural necessity takes away or shuts out all virtue, so this propensity approaches to an abolition of virtue, that is, it diminishes it. And on the other hand, natural difficulty in the state of things is an approach to natural impossibility. And as the latter, when it is complete and absolute, wholly takes away blame, so such difficulty takes away some blame or diminishes blame, and makes the thing done to be less worthy of punishment. 2. Men in their first use of such phrases as these, must, cannot help it, cannot avoid it, necessary, unable, impossible, unavoidable, irresistible, etc., use them to signify a necessity of constraint or restraint, a natural necessity or impossibility, or some necessity that the will has nothing to do in, which may be whether men will or no, and which may be supposed to be just the same, let men's inclinations and desires be what they will. Such kind of terms, in their original use, I suppose, among all nations, are relative, carrying in their signification, as was before observed, a reference or respect to some contrary will, desire, or endeavor, which, it is supposed, is or may be in the case. All men find and begin to find in early childhood that there are innumerable things that cannot be done which they desire to do, and innumerable things which they are averse to that must be. They cannot avoid them. They will be, whether they choose them or no. It is to express this necessity which men so soon and so often find, and which so greatly and early affects them in innumerable cases, that such terms and phrases are first formed, and it is to signify such a necessity that they are first used, and that they are most constantly used in the common affairs of life, and not to signify any such metaphysical, speculative, and abstract notion as that connection in the nature or course of things which is between the subject and predicate of a proposition, and which is the foundation of the certain truth of that proposition, to signify which they who employ themselves in philosophical inquiries into the first origin and metaphysical relations and dependencies of things have borrowed these terms for want of others. But we grow up from our cradles in a use of such terms and phrases entirely different from this, and carrying a sense exceeding diverse from that in which they are commonly used in the controversy between Arminians and Calvinists. And it being, as was said before, a dictate of the universal sense of mankind, evident to us as soon as we begin to think that the necessity signified by these terms, in the sense in which we first learn them, does excuse persons and free them from all fault or blame, hence our idea of excusableness or faultlessness is tied to these terms and phrases by a strong habit, which is begun in childhood, as soon as we begin to speak, and grows up with us, and is strengthened by constant use and custom, the connection growing stronger and stronger. The habitual connection which is in men's minds between blamelessness and those aforementioned terms, must, cannot, unable, necessary, impossible, unavoidable, etc., becomes very strong, because as soon as ever men begin to use reason and speech, they have occasion to excuse themselves from the natural necessity signified by these terms in numerous instances. I cannot do it, I could not help it, and all mankind have constant and daily occasion to use such phrases in this sense, to excuse themselves and others in almost all the concerns of life with respect to disappointments and things that happen, which concern and affect ourselves and others, that are hurtful or disagreeable to us or them, or things desirable that we or others fail of. That a being accustomed to an union of different ideas from early childhood makes the habitual connection exceeding strong, as though such connection were owing to nature, is manifest in innumerable instances. It is altogether by such an habitual connection of ideas that men judge of the bigness or distance of the objects of sight, from their appearance. Thus it is owing to such a connection early established and growing up with a person that he judges a mountain, which he sees at 10 miles distance, to be bigger than his nose or further off than the end of it. Having been used so long to join a considerable distance and magnitude with such an appearance, men imagine it is by a dictate of natural sense, whereas it would be quite otherwise with one that had his eyes newly opened, who had been born blind. He would have the same visible appearance, but natural sense would dictate no such thing concerning the magnitude or distance of what appeared. 3. When men, after they had been so habituated to connect ideas of innocency or blamelessness with such terms that the union seems to be the effect of mere nature, come to hear the same terms used and learn to use them themselves in the forementioned new and metaphysical sense, to signify quite another sort of necessity which has no such kind of relation to a contrary supposable will and endeavor. The notation of plain and manifest blamelessness by this means is, by a strong prejudice, insensibly and unwarily transferred to a case to which it by no means belongs, the change of the use of the terms to a signification which is very diverse, not being taken notice of or adverted to, and there are several reasons why it is not. 1. The terms as used by philosophers are not very distinct and clear in their meaning. Few use them in a fixed, determined sense. On the contrary, their meaning is very vague and confused, which is what commonly happens to the words used to signify things intellectual and moral, and to express what Mr. Locke calls mixed modes. If men had a clear and distinct understanding of what is intended by these metaphysical terms, they would be able more easily to compare them with their original and common sense, and so would not be so easily led into delusion by any sort of terms in the world as by words of this sort. 2. The change of the signification of the terms is the more insensible because the things signified, though indeed very different, yet do in some generals agree. In necessity, that which is vulgarly so called, there is a strong connection between the thing said to be necessary and some thing antecedent to it in the order of nature, so there is also in philosophical necessity. And though in both kinds of necessity the connection cannot be called by that name with relation to an opposite will or endeavor, to which it is superior, which is the case in vulgar necessity, yet in both the connection is prior to will and endeavor, and so, in some respect, superior. In both kinds of necessity there is a foundation for some certainty of the proposition that affirms the event, the terms used being the same and the things signified agreeing in these and some other general circumstances, and the expressions as used by philosophers being not well defined and so of obscure and loose signification. Hence persons are not aware of the great difference, and the notions of innocence or faultiness, which were so strongly associated with them, and were strictly united in their minds ever since they can remember, remain united with them still, as if the union were altogether natural and necessary, and they that go about to make a separation seem to them to do great violence even to nature itself. 4. Another reason why it appears difficult to reconcile it with reason that men should be blamed for that which is necessary with a moral necessity, which, as was observed before, is a species of philosophical necessity, is that for want of due consideration men inwardly entertain that apprehension that this necessity may be against men's wills and sincere endeavors. They go away with that notion that men may truly will and wish and strive that it may be otherwise, but that invincible necessity stands in the way, and many think thus concerning themselves. Some that are wicked men think they wish that they were good, that they love God in holiness, but yet do not find that their wishes produce the effect. The reasons why men think so are as follows. 1. They find what may be called an indirect willingness to have a better will, in the manner before observed. For it is impossible and a contradiction to suppose the will to be directly and properly against itself, and they do not consider that this indirect willingness is entirely a different thing from properly willing the thing that is the duty and virtue required, and that there is no virtue in that sort of willingness which they have. They do not consider that the volitions which a wicked man may have that he loved God are no acts of the will at all against the moral evil of not loving God, but only some disagreeable consequences. But the making the requisite distinction requires more care of reflection and thought than most men are used to, and men, through a prejudice in their own favor, are disposed to think well of their own desires and dispositions, and to account them good and virtuous, though their respect to virtue be only indirect and remote, and it is nothing at all that is virtuous that truly excites or terminates their inclinations. 2. Another thing that insensibly lends and beguiles men into a supposition that this moral necessity or impossibility is, or may be, against men's wills and true endeavors, is the derivation and formation of the terms themselves that are often used to express it, which is such as seemed directly to point to and hold this forth. Such words, for instance, as unable, unavoidable, impossible, irresistible, which carry a plain reference to a supposable power exerted, endeavors used, resistance made, in opposition to the necessity, and the persons that hear them, not considering nor suspecting that they are used in their proper sense, that sense being therefore understood, there does naturally and as it were necessarily arise in their minds a supposition that it may be so indeed, that true desires and endeavors may take place, but that invincible necessity stands in the way and renders them vain and to no effect. 5. Another thing which makes persons more ready to suppose it to be contrary to reason that men should be exposed to the punishments threatened to sin, for doing those things which are morally necessary or not doing those things morally impossible, is that imagination strengthens the argument and adds greatly to the power and influence of the seeming reasons against it from the greatness of that punishment. To allow that they may be justly exposed to a small punishment would not be so difficult, whereas if there were any good reason in the case, if it were truly a dictate of reason, that such necessity was inconsistent with faultiness or just punishment, the demonstration would be equally certain with respect to a small punishment or any punishment at all as to a very great one. But it is not equally easy to the imagination. They that argue against the justice of damning men for those things that are thus necessary seem to make their argument the stronger by setting forth the greatness of the punishment in strong expressions. That a man should be cast into eternal burnings, that he should be made to fry in hell to all eternity, for those things which he had no power to avoid, and was under a fatal, unfrustrable, invincible necessity of doing. It is agreeable to common sense and the natural notions of mankind to suppose moral necessity to be consistent with praise and blame, reward and punishment. Whether the reasons that have been given, why it appears difficult to some persons to reconcile with common sense the praising or blaming, rewarding or punishing those things which are morally necessary, are thought satisfactory or not, yet it most evidently appears by the following things, that if this matter be rightly understood, setting aside all delusion arising from the impropriety and ambiguity of terms, this is not at all inconsistent with the natural apprehensions of mankind, and that sense of things which is found everywhere in the common people, who are furthest from having their thoughts perverted from their natural channel by metaphysical and philosophical subtleties, but, on the contrary, altogether agreeable to, and the very voice and dictate of, this natural and vulgar sense. 1. This will appear if we consider what the vulgar notion of blameworthiness is, the idea which the common people through all ages and nations have of faultiness, I suppose to be plainly this: a person's being or doing wrong with his own will and pleasure, containing these two things: 1. His doing wrong when he does as he pleases; 2. His pleasures being wrong, or in other words, perhaps more intelligibly expressing their notion, a person's having his heart wrong and doing wrong from his heart, and this is the sum total of the matter. The common people do not ascend up in their reflections and abstractions to the metaphysical sources, relations, and dependencies of things in order to form their notion of faultiness or blameworthiness. They do not wait till they have decided by their refinings what first determines the will, whether it be determined by something extrinsic or intrinsic, whether volition determines volition, or whether the understanding determines the will, whether there be any such thing as metaphysicians mean by contingents, if they have any meaning, whether there be a sort of a strange, unaccountable sovereignty in the will, in the exercise of which, by its own sovereign acts, it brings to pass all its own sovereign acts. They do not take any part of their notion of fault or blame from the resolution of any such question. If this were the case, there are multitudes, yea, the far greater part of mankind, 999 out of 1,000, would live and die without having any such notion as that of fault ever entering into their heads, or without so much as one having any conception that any body was to be either blamed or commended for anything. To be sure, it would be a long time before men came to have such notions, whereas it is manifest they are some of the first notions that appear in children, who discover, as soon as they can think or speak or act at all as rational creatures, a sense of desert. And certainly, in forming their notion of it, they make no use of metaphysics. All the ground they go upon consists in these two things, experience, and a natural sensation of a certain fitness or agreeableness which there is in uniting such moral evil as is above described, vis-a-vis a being or doing wrong with the will, and resentment in others and pain inflicted on the person in whom this moral evil is, which natural sense is what we call by the name of conscience. It is true the common people and children, in their notion of any faulty act or deed of any person, do suppose that it is the person's own act and deed. But this is all that belongs to what they understand by a thing's being a person's own deed or action, even that it is something done by him of choice. That some exercise or motion should begin of itself does not belong to their notion of an action or doing. If so, it would belong to their notion of it, that it is something which is the cause of its own beginning, and that is as much as to say that it is before it begins to be. Nor is their notion of an action some motion or exercise that begins accidentally, without any cause or reason, for that is contrary to one of the prime dictates of common sense, namely, that everything that begins to be has some cause or reason why it is. The common people in their notion of a faulty or praiseworthy deed or work done by any one do suppose that the man does it in the exercise of liberty, but then their notion of liberty is only a person's having opportunity of doing as he pleases. They have no notion of liberty consisting in the will's first acting, and so causing its own acts, and determining, and so causing its own determinations, or choosing, and so causing its own choice. Such a notion of liberty is what none have, but those that have darkened their own minds with confused metaphysical speculation and abstruse and ambiguous terms. If a man is not restrained from acting as his will determines, or constrained to act otherwise, then he has liberty according to common notions of liberty, without taking into the idea that grand contradiction of all, the determinations of a man's free will being the effects of the determinations of his free will. Nor have men commonly any notion of freedom consisting in indifference. For if so, then it would be agreeable to their notion that the greater indifference men act with, the more freedom they act with, whereas the reverse is true. He that, in acting, proceeds with the fullest inclination does what he does with the greatest freedom according to common sense. And so far is it from being agreeable to common sense that such liberty as consists in indifference is requisite to praise or blame, that, on the contrary, the dictate of every man's natural sense through the world is, that the further he is from being indifferent in his acting good or evil, and the more he does either with full and strong inclination, the more is he esteemed or abhorred, commended or condemned. 2. If it were consistent with the common sense of mankind that men should be either to be blamed or commended in any volitions they have or fail of, in case of moral necessity or impossibility, then it would surely also be agreeable to the same sense and reason of mankind that the nearer the case approaches to such a moral necessity or impossibility, either through a strong antecedent moral propensity on the one hand, or a great antecedent opposition and difficulty on the other, the nearer does it approach to a being neither blamable nor commendable, so that acts exerted with such preceding propensity would be worthy of proportionably less praise, and when omitted, the act being attended with such difficulty, the omission would be worthy of less blame. It is so, as was observed before, with natural necessity and impossibility, propensity and difficulty, as it is a plain dictate of the sense of all mankind, that natural necessity and impossibility take away all blame and praise, and therefore that the nearer the approach is to these, through previous propensity or difficulty, so praise and blame are proportionably diminished. And if it were as much a dictate of common sense that moral necessity of doing or impossibility of avoiding takes away all praise and blame, as that natural necessity or impossibility does this, then, by a perfect parity of reason, it would be as much the dictate of common sense that an approach to moral necessity of doing or impossibility of avoiding diminishes praise and blame, as that an approach to natural necessity and impossibility does so. It is equally the voice of common sense that persons are excusable in part in neglecting things difficult against their wills, as that they are excusable wholly in neglecting things impossible against their wills. And if it made no difference whether the impossibility were natural and against the will, or moral lying in the will with regard to excusableness, so neither would it make any difference whether the difficulty or approach to necessity be natural against the will, or moral lying in the propensity of the will. But it is apparent that the reverse of these things is true. If there be an approach to a moral necessity in a man's exertion of good acts of will, they being the exercise of a strong propensity to good, and a very powerful love to virtue, it is so far from being the dictate of common sense that he is less virtuous and the less to be esteemed, loved, and praised, that it is agreeable to the natural notions of all mankind, that he is so much the better man, worthy of greater respect and higher commendation. And the stronger the inclination is, and the nearer it approaches to necessity in that respect, or to impossibility of neglecting the virtuous act, or of doing a vicious one, still the more virtuous and worthy of higher commendation. And on the other hand, if a man exerts evil acts of mind, as for instance acts of pride or malice, from a rooted and strong habit or principle of haughtiness and maliciousness, and a violent propensity of heart to such acts, according to the natural sense of men, he is so far from being the less hateful and blamable on that account, that he is so much the more worthy to be detested and condemned by all that observe him. Moreover, it is manifest that it is no part of the notion which mankind commonly have of a blamable or praiseworthy act of the will, that it is an act which is not determined by an antecedent bias or motive, but by the sovereign power of the will itself, because if so, the greater hand such causes have in determining any acts of the will, so much the less virtuous or vicious would they be accounted, and the less hand, the more virtuous or vicious. Whereas the reverse is true, men do not think a good act to be the less praiseworthy for the agent's being much determined in it by a good inclination or a good motive, but the more. And if good inclination or motive has but little influence in determining the agent, they do not think his act so much the more virtuous, but the less, and so concerning evil acts which are determined by evil motives or inclinations. Yea, if it be supposed that good or evil dispositions are implanted in the hearts of men by nature itself, which it is certain is vulgarly supposed in innumerable cases, yet it is not commonly supposed that men are worthy of no praise or dispraise for such dispositions, although what is natural is undoubtedly necessary, nature being prior to all acts of the will whatsoever. Thus, for instance, if a man appears to be of a very haughty or malicious disposition, and is supposed to be so by his natural temper, it is no vulgar notion, no dictate of the common sense and apprehension of men, that such dispositions are no vices or moral evils, or that such persons are not worthy of disesteem or odium and dishonor, or that the proud or malicious acts which flow from such natural dispositions are worthy of no resentment. Yea, such vile natural dispositions and the strength of them will commonly be mentioned rather as an aggravation of the wicked acts that come from such a fountain than an extenuation of them. Its being natural for men to act thus is often observed by men in the height of their indignation. They will say, "It is his very nature, he is of a vile natural temper, it is as natural to him to act so as it is to breathe, he cannot help serving the devil," etc. But it is not thus with regard to hurtful, mischievous things, that any are the subjects or occasions of, by natural necessity against their inclinations. In such a case, the necessity by the common voice of mankind will be spoken of as a full excuse. Thus, it is very plain that common sense makes a vast difference between these two kinds of necessity as to the judgment it makes of their influence on the moral quality and desert of men's actions. And these dictates of men's minds are so natural and necessary that it may be very much doubted whether the Arminians themselves have ever got rid of them, yea, their greatest doctors that have gone furthest in defense of their metaphysical notions of liberty, and have brought their arguments to their greatest strength, and, as they suppose, to a demonstration against the consistence of virtue and vice with any necessity, it is to be questioned whether there is so much as one of them, but that, if he suffered very much from the injurious acts of a man under the power of an invincible haughtiness and malignancy of temper, would not, from the forementioned natural sense of mind, resent it far otherwise than if as great sufferings came upon him from the wind that blows, and the fire that burns, by natural necessity, and otherwise than he would if he suffered as much from the conduct of a man perfectly delirious, yea, though he first brought his distraction upon him some way by his own fault. Some seem to disdain the distinction that we make between natural and moral necessity, as though it were altogether impertinent in this controversy. That which is necessary, say they, is necessary. It is that which must be and cannot be prevented, and that which is impossible and cannot be done, and therefore none can be to blame for not doing it. And such comparisons are made use of as the commanding of a man to walk who has lost his legs, and condemning and punishing him for not obeying, inviting and calling upon a man who is shut up in a strong prison to come forth, etc. But in these things Arminians are very unreasonable. Let common sense determine whether there be not a great difference between these two cases, the one that of a man who has offended his prince and is cast into prison, and after he is laid there a while the king comes to him, calls him to come forth to him, and tells him that if he will do so, and will fall down before him, and humbly beg his pardon, he shall be forgiven and set at liberty, and also be greatly enriched and advanced to honor. The prisoner heartily repents of the folly and wickedness of his offense against his prince, is thoroughly disposed to abase himself and accept the king's offer, but is confined by strong walls with gates of brass and bars of iron. The other case is that of a man who is of a very unreasonable spirit, of a haughty, ungrateful, wilful disposition, and, moreover, has been brought up in traitorous principles, and has his heart possessed with an extreme and inveterate enmity to his lawful sovereign, and for his rebellion is cast into prison and lies long there, loaded with heavy chains and in miserable circumstances. At length the compassionate prince comes to the prison, orders his chains to be knocked off, and his prison doors to be set wide open, calls to him and tells him, if he will come forth to him and fall down before him, acknowledge that he has treated him unworthily, and ask his forgiveness, he shall be forgiven, set at liberty, and set in a place of great dignity and profit in his court. But he is stout and stomachful and full of haughty malignity that he cannot be willing to accept the offer. His rooted strong pride and malice have perfect power over him, and as it were bind him by binding his heart. The opposition of his heart has the mastery over him, having an influence on his mind far superior to the king's grace and condescension, and to all his kind offers and promises. Now, is it agreeable to common sense to assert, and stand to it, that there is no difference between these two cases as to any worthiness of blame in the prisoners, because, forsooth, there is a necessity in both, and the required act in each case is impossible? It is true a man's evil dispositions may be as strong and immovable as the bars of a castle. But who cannot see that when a man in the latter case is said to be unable to obey the command, the expression is used improperly and not in the sense it has originally and in common speech, and that it may properly be said to be in the rebel's power to come out of prison, seeing he can easily do it if he pleases, though by reason of his vile temper of heart, which is fixed and rooted, it is impossible that it should please him. Upon the whole, I presume there is no person of good understanding who impartially considers the things which have been observed, but will allow that it is not evident from the dictates of the common sense or natural notions of mankind that moral necessity is inconsistent with praise and blame, and therefore if the Arminians would prove any such inconsistency, it must be by some philosophical and metaphysical arguments, and not common sense. There is a grand illusion in the pretended demonstration of Arminians from common sense. The main strength of all these demonstrations lies in that prejudice that arises through the insensible change of the use and meaning of such terms as liberty, able, unable, necessary, impossible, unavoidable, invincible, action, etc., from their original and vulgar sense to a metaphysical sense entirely diverse, and the strong connection of the ideas of blamelessness, etc., with some of these terms, by a habit contracted and established while these terms were used in their first meaning. This prejudice and delusion is the foundation of all those positions they lay down as maxims, by which most of the scriptures which they allege in this controversy are interpreted, and on which all their pompous demonstrations from Scripture and reason depend. From this secret delusion and prejudice they have almost all their advantages. It is the strength of their bulwarks and the edge of their weapons, and this is the main ground of all the right they have to treat their neighbors in so assuming a manner, and to insult others, perhaps as wise and good as themselves, as weak bigots, men that dwell in the dark caves of superstition, perversely set, obstinately shutting their eyes against the noonday light, enemies to common sense, maintaining the firstborn of absurdities, etc., etc. But perhaps an impartial consideration of the things which have been observed in the preceding parts of this inquiry may enable the lovers of truth better to judge whose doctrine is indeed absurd, abstruse, self-contradictory, and inconsistent with common sense, and many ways repugnant to the universal dictates of the reason of mankind. Corollary. From things which have been observed, it will follow that it is agreeable to common sense to suppose that the glorified saints have not their freedom at all diminished in any respect, and that God Himself has the highest possible freedom according to the true and proper meaning of the term, and that He is, in the highest possible respect, an agent and active in the exercise of His infinite holiness, though He acts therein in the highest degree necessarily, and His actions of this kind are in the highest, most absolutely perfect manner, virtuous and praiseworthy, and are so for that very reason, because they are most perfectly necessary. Concerning those objections, that this scheme of necessity renders all means and endeavors for the avoiding of sin, or the obtaining virtue and holiness, vain and to no purpose, and that it makes men no more than mere machines in affairs of morality and religion. Arminians say, if it be so that sin and virtue come to pass by a necessity consisting in a sure connection of causes and effects, antecedents and consequents, it can never be worth the while to use any means or endeavors to obtain the one and avoid the other, seeing no endeavors can alter the futurity of the event, which is become necessary by a connection already established. But I desire that this matter may be fully considered, and that it may be examined with a thorough strictness whether it will follow that endeavors and means, in order to avoid or obtain any future thing, must be more in vain on the supposition of such a connection of antecedents and consequence than if the contrary be supposed. For endeavors to be in vain is for them not to be successful, that is to say, for them not eventually to be the means of the thing aimed at, which cannot be but in one of these two ways, either first, that although the means are used, yet the event aimed at does not follow, or secondly, if the event does follow, it is not because of the means, or from any connection or dependence of the event on the means. The event would have come to pass as well without the means as with them. If either of these two things is the case, then the means are not properly successful and are truly in vain. The successfulness or unsuccessfulness of means in order to an effect, or their being in vain or not in vain, consists in those means being connected or not connected with the effect, in such a manner as this, viz., that the effect is with the means and not without them, or that the being of the effect is, on the one hand, connected with means, and the want of the effect, on the other hand, is connected with the want of the means. If there be such a connection as this between means and end, the means are not in vain. The more there is of such a connection, the further they are from being in vain, and the less of such a connection, the more they are in vain. Now, therefore, the question to be answered in order to determine whether it follows from this doctrine of the necessary connection between foregoing things and consequent ones that means used in order to any effect are more in vain than they would be otherwise, is whether it follows from it that there is less of the aforementioned connection between means and effect, that is, whether on the supposition of there being a real and true connection between means and effect, than on the supposition of there being no fixed connection between antecedent things and consequent ones, and the very stating of this question is sufficient to answer it. It must appear to everyone that will open his eyes that this question cannot be affirmed without the grossest absurdity and inconsistence. Means are foregoing things, and effects are following things, and if there were no connection between foregoing things and following ones, there could be no connection between means and end, and so all means would be wholly vain and fruitless. For it is by virtue of some connection only that they become successful. It is some connection observed or revealed or otherwise known between antecedent things and following ones, that is, what directs in the choice of means. And if there were no such thing as an established connection, there would be no choice as to means. One thing would have no more tendency to an effect than another. There would be no such thing as tendency in the case. All those things which are successful means of other things do therein prove connected antecedents of them, and therefore to assert that a fixed connection between antecedents and consequence makes means vain and useless, or stands in the way to hinder the connection between means and end, is just as ridiculous as to say that a connection between antecedents and consequence stands in the way to hinder a connection between antecedents and consequence. Nor can any supposed connection of the succession or train of antecedents and consequence from the very beginning of all things, the connection being made already sure and necessary either by established laws of nature, or by these together with a decree of sovereign immediate interpositions of divine power, on such and such occasions, or any other way, if any other way there be, I say no such necessary connection of a series of antecedents and consequence can in the least tend to hinder, but that the means we use may belong to the series, and so may be some of those antecedents which are connected with the consequence we aim at in the established course of things. Endeavors which we use are things that exist, and therefore they belong to the general chain of events, all the parts of which chain are supposed to be connected, and so endeavors are supposed to be connected with some effects or some consequent things or other. And certainly this does not hinder, but that the events they are connected with may be those which we aim at, and which we choose because we judge them most likely to have a connection with those events from the established order and course of things which we observe, or from something in divine revelation. Let us suppose a real and true connection between a man's having his eyes open in the clear daylight, with good organs of sight and seeing, so that seeing is connected with his opening his eyes, and not seeing with his not opening his eyes, and also the like connection between such a man's attempting to open his eyes and his actually doing it, the supposed established connection between these antecedents and consequence, let the connection be never so sure and necessary, certainly does not prove that it is in vain for a man in such circumstances to attempt to open his eyes in order to seeing his aiming at that event, and the use of the means, being the effect of his will, does not break the connection or hinder the success. So that the objection we are upon does not lie against the doctrine of the necessity of events by a certainty of connection and consequence. On the contrary, it is truly forcible against the Arminian doctrine of contingence and self-determination, which is inconsistent with such a connection. If there be no connection between those events wherein virtue and vice consist, and anything antecedent, then there is no connection between these events and any means or endeavors used in order to them, and if so, then those means must be in vain. The less there is of connection between foregoing things and following ones, so much the less there is between means and end, endeavors and success, and in the same proportion are means and endeavors ineffectual and in vain. It will follow from Arminian principles that there is no degree of connection between virtue or vice and any foregoing event or thing. Or in other words, that the determination of the existence of virtue or vice does not in the least depend on the influence of anything that comes to pass antecedently, from which the determination of its existence is, as its cause, means, or ground, because, so far as it is so, it is not from self-determination, and therefore, so far there is nothing of the nature of virtue or vice. And so it follows that virtue and vice are not at all in any degree dependent upon or connected with any foregoing event or existence, as its cause, ground, or means, and if so, then all foregoing means must be totally in vain. Hence it follows that there cannot, in any consistence with the Arminian scheme, be any reasonable ground of so much as a conjecture concerning the consequence of any means and endeavors, in order to escaping vice or obtaining virtue, or any choice or preference of means, as having a greater probability of success by some than others, either from any natural connection or dependence of the end on the means, or through any divine constitution or revealed way of God's bestowing or bringing to pass these things in consequence of any means, endeavors, prayers, or deeds. Conjectures in this latter case depend on a supposition that God himself is the giver or determining cause of the events sought. But if they depend on self-determination, then God is not the determining or disposing author of them. And if these things are not of his disposal, then no conjecture can be made from any revelation he has given concerning any way or method of his disposal of them. Yea, on these principles it will not only follow that men cannot have any reasonable ground of judgment or conjecture that their means and endeavors to obtain virtue or avoid vice will be successful, but they may be sure they will not. They may be certain that they will be in vain, and that if ever the thing which they seek comes to pass, it will not be at all owing to the means they use, for means and endeavors can have no effect at all in order to obtain the end, but in one of those two ways, either one, through a natural tendency and influence to prepare and dispose the mind more to virtuous acts, either by causing the disposition of the heart to be more in favor of such acts, or by bringing the mind more into the view of powerful motives and inducements, or 2, by putting persons more in the way of God's bestowment of the benefit. But neither of these can be the case, not the latter, for, as has been just observed, it does not consist with the Arminian notion of self-determination, which they suppose essential to virtue, that God should be the bestower, or, which is the same thing, the determining disposing author of virtue. Not the form, for natural influence and tendency supposes causality and connection, and supposes necessity of event, which is inconsistent with Arminian liberty. A tendency of means by biasing the heart in favor of virtue, or by bringing the will under the influence and power of motives in its determinations, are both inconsistent with Arminian liberty of will, consisting in indifference and sovereign self-determination, as has been largely demonstrated. But for the more full removal of this prejudice against the doctrine of necessity, which has been maintained as though it tended to encourage a total neglect of all endeavors as vain, the following things may be considered. The question is not whether men may not thus improve this doctrine. We know that many true and wholesome doctrines are abused, but whether the doctrine gives any just occasion for such an improvement, or whether, on the supposition of the truth of the doctrine, such a use of it would be unreasonable. If any shall affirm that it would not, but that the very nature of the doctrine is such as gives just occasion for it, it must be on this supposition, namely, that such an invariable necessity of all things already settled must render the interposition of all means, endeavors, conclusions, or actions of ours in order to the obtaining any future end whatsoever perfectly insignificant, because they cannot in the least alter or vary the course and series of things, in any event or circumstance, all being already fixed unutterably by necessity, and that therefore it is folly for men to use any means for any end, but their wisdom to save themselves the trouble of endeavors and take their ease. No person can draw such an inference from this doctrine and come to such a conclusion without contradicting himself and going counter to the very principles he pretends to act upon, for he comes to a conclusion and takes a course in order to an end, even his case, or the saving himself from trouble he seeks something future, and uses means in order to a future thing, even in his drawing up that conclusion that he will seek nothing and use no means in order to anything in future. He seeks his future ease and the benefit and comfort of indolence. If prior necessity that determines all things makes vain all actions or conclusions of ours in order to anything future, then it makes vain all conclusions and conduct of ours in order to our future ease. The measurement of our ease with the time, manner, and every circumstance of it is already fixed, by all-determining necessity as much as anything else. If he says within himself, "What future happiness or misery I shall have is already in effect determined by the necessary course and connection of things, therefore I will save myself the trouble of labor and diligence which cannot add to my determined degree of happiness, or diminish my misery, but will take my ease and will enjoy the comfort of sloth and negligence," such a man contradicts himself. He says the measure of his future happiness and misery is already fixed, and he will not try to diminish the one nor add to the other. But yet, in his very conclusion, he contradicts this, for he takes up this conclusion to add to his future happiness by the ease and comfort of his negligence, and to diminish his future trouble and misery by saving himself the trouble of using means and taking pains. Therefore, persons cannot reasonably make this improvement of the doctrine of necessity, that they will go into a voluntary negligence of means for their own happiness. For the principles they must go upon in order to this are inconsistent with their making any improvement at all of the doctrine. for to make some improvement of it is to be influenced by it, to come to some voluntary conclusion in regard to their own conduct, with some view or aim. But this, as has been shown, is inconsistent with the principles they pretend to act upon. In short, the principles are such as cannot be acted upon at all, or in any respect consistently. And therefore, in every pretense of acting upon them, or making any improvement at all of them, there is a self-contradiction. As to that objection against the doctrine, which I have endeavored to prove, that it makes men no more than mere machines, I would say that, notwithstanding this doctrine, man is entirely, perfectly, and unspeakably different from a mere machine in that he has reason and understanding, and has a faculty of will, and is so capable of volition and choice, and in that his will is guided by the dictates or views of his understanding, and in that his external actions and behavior, and in many respects also his thoughts and the exercises of his mind, are subject to his will, so that he has liberty to act according to his choice, and do what he pleases, and by means of these things is capable of moral habits and moral acts, such inclinations and actions as, according to the common sense of mankind, are worthy of praise, esteem, love, and reward, or, on the contrary, of disesteem, detestation, indignation, and punishment. In these things is all the difference from mere machines as to liberty and agency that would be any perfection, dignity, or privilege in any respect, all the difference that can be desired and all that can be conceived of, and indeed all that the pretensions of the Arminians themselves come to, as they are forced often to explain themselves, though their explications overthrow and abolish the things asserted and pretended to be explained. For they are forced to explain a self-determining power of will by a power in the soul to determine as it chooses or wills, which comes to no more than this, that a man has a power of choosing, and in many instances can do as he chooses, which is quite a different thing from that contradiction, his having power of choosing his first act of choice in the case. Or if their scheme makes any other difference than this between men and machines, it is for the worse. It is so far from supposing men to have a dignity and privilege above machines, that it makes the manner of their being determined still more unhappy. Whereas machines are guided by an understanding cause, by the skillful hand of the workman or owner, the will of man is left to the guidance of nothing but absolute blind contingents. Concerning that objection against the doctrine which has been maintained, that it agrees with the Stoical doctrine of faith and the opinions of Mr. Hobbes. When Calvinists oppose the Arminian notion of the freedom of will and contingence of volition, and insist that there are no acts of the will nor any other event whatsoever, but what are attended with some kind of necessity, their opposers cry out against them as agreeing with the ancient Stoics in their doctrine of fate, and with Mr. Hobbes in his opinion of necessity. It would not be worthwhile to take notice of so impertinent an objection had it not been urged by some of the chief Arminian writers. There were many important truths maintained by the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, and especially the Stoics, that are never the worse for being held by them. The Stoic philosophers, by the general agreement of Christian divines and even Arminian divines, were the greatest, wisest, and most virtuous of all the heathen philosophers, and in their doctrine and practice came the nearest to Christianity of any of their sects. How frequently are the sayings of these philosophers in many of the writings and sermons, even of Arminian divines, produced not as arguments of the falseness of the doctrines which they delivered, but as a confirmation of some of the greatest truths of the Christian religion, relating to the unity and perfections of the Godhead, a future state, the duty and happiness of mankind, etc., as observing how the light of nature and reason in the wisest and best of the heathen harmonized with and confirms the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it is very remarkable concerning Dr. Whitby that although he alleges the agreement of the Stoics with us, wherein he supposes they maintained the like doctrine with us as an argument against the truth of our doctrine, yet this very Dr. Whitby alleges the agreement of the Stoics with the Arminians, wherein he supposes they taught the same doctrine with them as an argument for the truth of their doctrine, so that, when the Stoics agree with them, this, it seems, is a confirmation of their doctrine and a confutation of ours, as showing that our opinions are contrary to the natural sense and common reason of mankind. Nevertheless, when the Stoics agree with us, It argues no such thing in our favor, but on the contrary, is a great argument against us and shows our doctrine to be heathenish. It is observed by some Calvinistic writers that the Arminians symbolize with the Stoics in some of those doctrines wherein they are opposed by the Calvinists, particularly in their denying an original, innate, total corruption and depravity of heart, and in what they held of man's ability to make himself truly virtuous and conform to God, and in some other doctrines. It may be further observed, it is certainly no better objection against our doctrine that it agrees in some respects with the doctrine of the ancient Stoic philosophers than it is against theirs, wherein they differ from us, that it agrees in some respects with the opinion of the very worst of the heathen philosophers, the followers of Epicurus, the father of atheism and licentiousness, and with the doctrine of the Sadducees and Jesuits. I am not much concerned to know precisely what the ancient Stoic philosophers held concerning fate, in order to determine what is truth, as though it were a sure way to be in the right, to take good heed to differ from them. It seems that they differed among themselves, and probably the doctrine of fate, as maintained by most of them, was, in some respects, erroneous. But whatever their doctrine was, if any of them held such a fate as is repugnant to any liberty, consisting in our doing as we please, I utterly deny such a fate. If they held any such fate as is not consistent with the common and universal notions that mankind have of liberty, activity, moral agency, virtue, and vice, I disclaim any such thing, and think I have demonstrated that the scheme I maintain is no such scheme. If the Stoics by fate meant anything of such a nature as can be supposed to stand in the way of the advantage and benefit of the use of means and endeavors, or make it less worth the while for men to desire and seek after anything wherein their virtue and happiness consists, I hold no doctrine that is clogged with any such inconvenience, any more than any other scheme whatsoever, and by no means so much as the Arminian scheme of contingents, as has been shown. If they held any such doctrine of universal fatality as is inconsistent with any kind of liberty, that is, or can be any perfection, dignity, privilege, or benefit, or anything desirable in any respect for any intelligent creature, or indeed with any liberty that is possible or conceivable, I embrace no such doctrine. If they held any such doctrine of fate as is inconsistent with the world's being in all things subject to the disposal of an intelligent, wise agent, that presides not as the soul of the world, but as the sovereign Lord of the universe, governing all things by proper will, choice, and design, in the exercise of the most perfect liberty conceivable, without subjection to any constraint or being properly under the power or influence of anything before, above, or without himself, I wholly renounce any such doctrine. As to Mr. Hobbes's maintaining the same doctrine concerning necessity, I confess it happens I never read Mr. Hobbes. Let his opinion be what it will, we need not reject all truth which is demonstrated by clear evidence, merely because it was once held by some bad man. This great truth, that Jesus is the Son of God, was not spoiled because it was once and again proclaimed with a loud voice by the devil. If truth is so defiled because it is spoken by the mouth or written by the pen of some ill-minded, mischievous man, that it must never be received, we shall never know when we hold any of the most precious and evident truths by a sure tenure. And if Mr. Hobbes has made a bad use of this truth, that is to be lamented, but the truth is not to be thought worthy of rejection on that account. It is common for the corruptions of the hearts of evil men to abuse the best things to vile purposes. I might also take notice of its having been observed that the Arminians agree with Mr. Hobbes in many more things than the Calvinists, as in what he is said to hold concerning original sin, in denying the necessity of supernatural illumination, in denying infused grace, in denying the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and other things. Concerning the necessity of the divine will. Some may possibly object against what has been supposed of the absurdity and inconsistence of a self-determining power in the will, and the impossibility of its being otherwise than that the will should be determined in every case by some motive, and by a motive which, as it stands in the view of the understanding, is of superior strength to any appearing on the other side. That if these things are true, it will follow that not only the will of created minds, but the will of God himself is necessary in all its determinations. concerning which says the author of the Essay on the Freedom of Will in God and in the Creature, pages 85 and 86, "What strange doctrine is this, contrary to all our ideas of the dominion of God? Does it not destroy the glory of his liberty of choice, and take away from the Creator and Governor and Benefactor of the world, that most free and sovereign agent, all the glory of this sort of freedom? Does it not seem to make him a kind of mechanical medium of fate, and introduce Mr. Hobbes's doctrine of fatality and necessity into all things that God hath to do with? Does it not seem to represent the blessed God as a being of vast understanding, as well as power and efficiency, but still to leave him without a will to choose among all the objects within his view? In short, it seems to make the blessed God a sort of almighty minister of fate under its universal and supreme influence, as it was the professed sentiment of some of the ancients, that fate was above the gods. This is declaiming rather than arguing, and an application to men's imaginations and prejudices rather than to mere reason. But I would calmly endeavor to consider whether there be any reason in this frightful representation. But before I enter upon a particular consideration of the matter, I should observe this, that it is reasonable to suppose it should be much more difficult to express or conceive things according to exact metaphysical truth, relating to the nature and manner of the existence of things in the divine understanding and will, and the operation of these faculties, if I may so call them, of the divine mind, than in the human mind, which is infinitely more within our view, and nearer to a proportion to the measure of our comprehension, and more commensurate to the use and import of human speech. Language is indeed very deficient in regard of terms to express precise truth concerning our own minds, and their faculties and operations. Words were first formed to express external things, and those that are applied to express things internal and spiritual are almost all borrowed and used in a sort of figurative sense. Whence they are, most of them, attended with a great deal of ambiguity and unfixedness in their signification, occasioning innumerable doubts, difficulties, and confusions in inquiries and controversies about things of this nature. But language is much less adapted to express things in the mind of the incomprehensible deity precisely as they are. We find a great deal of difficulty in conceiving exactly of the nature of our own souls, and notwithstanding all the progress which has been made in past and present ages in this kind of knowledge, whereby our metaphysics, as it relates to these things, is brought to greater perfection than once it was, yet here is still work enough left for future inquiries and researches, and room for progress still to be made, for many ages and generations. But we had need to be infinitely able metaphysicians to conceive with clearness, according to strict, proper, and perfect truth, concerning the nature of the divine essence, and the modes of the action and operation of the powers of the divine mind. And it may be noted particularly that though we are obliged to conceive of some things in God as consequent and dependent on others, and of some things pertaining to the divine nature and will as the foundation of others, and so before others in the order of nature, as we must conceive of the knowledge and holiness of God as prior in the order of nature to his happiness, the perfection of his understanding as the foundation of his wise purposes and decrees, the holiness of his nature as the cause and reason of his holy determinations. And yet when we speak of cause and effect, antecedent and consequent, fundamental and dependent, determining and determined, in the first being, who is self-existent, independent, of perfect and absolute simplicity and immutability, and the first cause of all things, doubtless there must be less propriety in such representations than when we speak of derived dependent beings, who are compounded and liable to perpetual mutation and succession. Having premised this, I proceed to observe concerning the forementioned author's exclamation about the necessary determination of God's will in all things by what he sees to be fittest and best. That all the seeming force of such objections and exclamations must arise from an imagination that there is some sort of privilege or dignity in being without such a moral necessity as will make it impossible to do any other than always choose what is wisest and best, as though there were some disadvantage, meanness, and subjection in such a necessity, a thing by which the will was confined, kept under, and held in servitude by something, which, as it were, maintained a strong and invincible power and dominion over it, by bonds that held him fast, and that he could by no means deliver himself from. Whereas this must be all mere imagination and delusion, It is no disadvantage or dishonor to a being necessarily to act in the most excellent and happy manner from the necessary perfection of his own nature. This argues no imperfection, inferiority, or dependence, nor any want of dignity, privilege, or ascendancy. It is not inconsistent with the absolute and most perfect sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God is his ability and authority to do whatever pleases him, whereby he doth according to his will in the armies of heaven and amongst the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What dost thou? The following things belong to the sovereignty of God, vis-a-vis 1. Supreme, universal, and infinite power, whereby he is able to do what he pleases without control, without any confinement of that power, without any subjection in the least measure to any other power, and so without any hindrance or restraint that it should be either impossible or at all difficult for him to accomplish his will, and without any dependence of his power on any other power from whence it should be derived, or which it should stand in any need of, so far from this that all other power is derived from him and is absolutely dependent on him. 2. That he has supreme authority, absolute and most perfect right to do what he wills, without subjection to any superior authority or any derivation of authority from any other, or limitation by any distinct independent authority, either superior, equal, or inferior, he being the head of all dominion and fountain of all authority, and also without restraint by any obligation, implying either subjection, derivation, or dependence, or proper limitation. 3. That his will is supreme, underived, and independent on anything without himself, being in everything determined by his own counsel, having no other rule but his own wisdom, his will not being subject to or restrained by the will of any other, and other wills being perfectly subject to his. 4. That his wisdom, which determines his will, is supreme, perfect, underived, self-sufficient, and independent, so that it may be said, as in Isaiah 40:14, with whom he took counsel, and who instructed him and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed to him the way of understanding. There is no other divine sovereignty but this, and this is properly absolute sovereignty. No other is desirable, nor would any other be honorable or happy, and indeed, there is no other conceivable or possible. It is the glory and greatness of the divine sovereign that God's will is determined by his own infinite, all-sufficient wisdom in everything, and in nothing at all is either directed by any inferior wisdom, or by no wisdom, whereby it would become senseless arbitrariness, determining and acting without reason, design, or end. If God's will is steadily and surely determined in everything by supreme wisdom, then it is in everything necessarily determined to that which is most wise, and certainly it would be a disadvantage and indignity to be otherwise. For if the divine will was not necessarily determined to that which, in every case, is wisest and best, it must be subject to some degree of undesigning contingence, and so in the same degree liable to evil. To suppose the divine will liable to be carried hither and thither at random by the uncertain wind of blind contingence, which is guided by no wisdom, no motive, no intelligent dictate whatsoever, if any such thing were possible, would certainly argue a great degree of imperfection and meanness, infinitely unworthy of the deity. If it be a disadvantage for the divine will to be attended with this moral necessity, then the more free from it and the more left at random, the greater dignity and advantage, and consequently to be perfectly free from the direction of understanding, and universally and entirely left to senseless, unmeaning contingence, to act absolutely at random, would be the supreme glory. It no more argues any dependence of God's will, that his supremely wise volition is necessary, than it argues a dependence of his being, that his existence is necessary. If it be something too low for the Supreme Being to have his will determined by moral necessity, so as necessarily, in every case, to will in the highest degree wholly and happily, then why is it not also something too low for him to have his existence and the infinite perfection of his nature and his infinite happiness determined by necessity? It is no more to God's dishonor to be necessarily wise than to be necessarily holy, and if neither of them be to his dishonor, then it is not to his dishonor necessarily to act holily and wisely. And if it be not dishonorable to be necessarily holy and wise, in the highest possible degree, no more is it mean and dishonorable necessarily to act holily and wisely in the highest possible degree, or, which is the same thing, to do that in every case which, above all things, is wisest and best. The reason why it is not dishonorable to be necessarily most holy is because holiness in itself is an excellent and honorable thing. For the same reason, it is no dishonor to be necessarily most wise, and, in every case, to act most wisely, or do the thing which is the wisest of all. For wisdom is also in itself excellent and honorable. The forementioned author of the Essay on the Freedom of Will, etc., as has been observed, represents that doctrine of the divine will's being in everything necessarily determined by a superior fitness, as making the blessed God a kind of almighty minister and mechanical medium of fate, and he insists, pages 93 and 94, that this moral necessity and impossibility is, in effect, the same thing with physical and natural necessity and impossibility. And in pages 54 and 55 he says, "The scheme which determines the will always and certainly by the understanding, and understanding by the appearance of things, seems to take away the true nature of vice and virtue. For the sublimest of virtues and the vilest of vices seem rather to be matters of fate and necessity, flowing naturally and necessarily from the existence, the circumstances, and present situation of persons and things. For this existence and situation necessarily makes such an appearance to the mind. From this appearance flows a necessary perception and judgment concerning these things. This judgment necessarily determines the will, and thus, by this chain of necessary causes, virtue and vice would lose their nature and become natural ideas and necessary things instead of moral and free actions." And yet this same author allows, pages 30 and 31, that a perfectly wise being will constantly and certainly choose what is most fit, and says, pages 102 and 103, "I grant and always have granted that wheresoever there is such antecedent superior fitness of things, God acts according to it, so as never to contradict it, and particularly in all his judicial proceedings, as a governor and distributor of rewards and punishments. Yea," he says expressly, page 42, "that it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness and goodness in things." So that, according to this author, putting these several passages of this essay together, there is no virtue, nor anything of a moral nature, in the most sublime and glorious acts and exercises of God's holiness, justice, and faithfulness, and he never does anything which is in itself supremely worthy, and above all other things fit and excellent, but only as a kind of mechanical medium of fate, and in what he does as the judge and moral governor of the world, he exercises no moral excellency, exercising no freedom in these things, because he acts by moral necessity, which is, in effect, the same with physical or natural necessity, and therefore he only acts by an hobbistical fatality, as a being indeed of vast understanding as well as power and efficiency, as he said before, but without a will to choose, being a kind of almighty administrator of fate, acting under its supreme influence. For he allows that in all these things God's will is determined constantly and certainly by a superior fitness, and that it is not possible for him to act otherwise. And if these things are so, what glory or praise belongs to God for doing holily and justly, or taking the most fit, holy, wise, and excellent course in any one instance? Whereas, according to the Scriptures and also the common sense of mankind, it does not in the least derogate from the honor of any being, that through the moral perfection of his nature he necessarily acts with supreme wisdom and holiness, but on the contrary his praise is the greater. Herein consists the height of his glory. The same author, page 56, supposes that herein appears the excellent character of a wise and good man, that though he can choose contrary to the fitness of things, yet he does not, but suffers himself to be directed by fitness, and that, in this conduct, he imitates the blessed God, and yet he supposes it is contrariwise with the blessed God, not that he suffers himself to be directed by fitness, when he can choose contrary to the fitness of things, but that he cannot choose contrary to the fitness of things, as he says, page 42, that it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness, where there is any fitness or goodness in things. Yea, he supposes, page 31, that if a man were perfectly wise and good, he could not do otherwise than be constantly and certainly determined by the fitness of things. One thing more I would observe before I conclude this section, and that is, that if it derogates nothing from the glory of God to be necessarily determined by superior fitness in some things, then neither does it be thus determined in all things, from anything in the nature of such necessity as at all detracting from God's freedom. independence, absolute supremacy, or any dignity or glory of his nature, state, or manner of acting, or as implying any infirmity, restraint, or subjection. And if the thing be such as well consists with God's glory, and has nothing tending at all to detract from it, then we need not be afraid of ascribing it to God in too many things, lest thereby we should detract from God's glory too much.